Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, May 21st, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the Texas 28th Congressional District. Now, from the title of this video, this sounds like it is a district that is extremely important in action, in results, and practically everything else, and it is very much true. The state of Texas is not necessarily a state where we see a lot of progressive politicians, but individually within this district, there is an opportunity that a progressive Democrat outs an incumbent Democrat from the left, meaning that they have taken more Democratic, more liberal or leftist leaning policies and stances than the incumbent. And the reason why this is a test for progressives across the United States is because, number one, it will be a test about their ability to win in districts such as this one, where you have a high minority population, specifically a very high Hispanic population within the 28th district, where, typically speaking, you find it difficult for progressive Democrats to win over any other demographic group besides white voters by a margin that could be comparable to what we are seeing with Jessica Cisneros. Now, looking at the 28th district in specific, there is also a second test that comes this November for these progressive Democrats because Henry Cuellar has been able to win in the 28th district for quite some time now by some pretty astounding margins, despite the district itself barely being a Democratic district. It has become more Democratic relative to the last election because of congressional redistricting, but only barely. It has a PVI of Democrat plus 7, which means it is entirely within reach for the GOP should Henry Cuellar not win the nomination, but is still also within reach should he win the nomination. But removing an incumbent does take away a very obvious bump and benefit for that incumbent, just simply because having the I by your name is the most powerful thing you can have as a congressional representative. But again, should the progressive nominee or candidate here, Jessica Cisneros, end up winning the nomination, it will be a test about progressive electability this November. So what exactly is happening? Well, back on March 17th, 2022, there was the 28th District Democratic primary that coincided with all of the Texas primaries. If you scroll up, you will actually find that there were primaries for practically every race, many of which did advance to a runoff, but the most important ones, such as governor and governor for both sides, ended up being pretty large victories for Greg Abbott and Beto O'Rourke. If you take a look further down and you take a look at the Attorney General's race, what do you find? It's heading off to a runoff election. Very similar thing to what is happening in also the 28th district. You also have the Democratic primary also advancing to a runoff, but it seems as if at least partially that there is an incumbent, not an incumbent, but a very clear frontrunner. On the lieutenant governor side, Dan Patrick easily won. On the Democratic side, however, it was a bit more competitive, and it will be interesting to see the two face off against each other this Tuesday. And in the congressional districts, in the 8th district, there was a decided margin. In the 15th, it advanced to a runoff. In the 15th, Republican side won there. 28th district Democratic primary advanced to a runoff, and that's practically the focus of this video. Now, this is actually not the first time that these two have faced off against each other. Just like there were primaries for this election, there were primaries back in 2020 as well. And in these primaries, Henry Cuellar was able to defeat Jessica Cisneros by about 4 percentage points across the district. It wasn't anything deafening, but he was able to avoid an instant runoff because he got above 50% of the vote. At the end of the day, it had to go above 50% of the vote because somebody was going to reach that point. Unless it was an exact tie, which obviously it wasn't, it was never going to head to a runoff election. So this was the one and done. Now that there was an inclusion of a third candidate in the 2022 race, that's largely what prompted it to head to a runoff election. Tanya Benavides, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, has endorsed Jessica Cisneros for this runoff election. So if you combine the vote shares, Cisneros would end up winning. But looking at the 2020 primary results, Cuellar was able to win with about 52% of the vote. It was not at all a large margin, and this was also a test for progressive Democrats back in 2020. But as we know and what we saw, what coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic, what coincided with Biden's surge in the Democratic primary in the 2020 election year, that's largely, I think, why we didn't see a Cisneros/progressive victory in Texas's 28th district, because it didn't make sense for who was winning on the top of the ticket. Now, this final margin here wasn't, again, impressive at all, which means that Cuellar definitely is in a possibility of losing this runoff, but it's definitely going to be close because he was given an opportunity to lose in the 28th district this time around, and he didn't. He actually got the most votes in the first round. So I am very interested to see what is happening in this Texas district, but the differences between the candidates could not be more apparent, especially on the issue of abortion. Representative Henry Cuellar is pro-life. He does not support, in a traditional sense, the pro-choice beliefs in abortion access. While it gets a little bit trickier when it comes down to exceptions and individual cases, on a much more broader sense and a true sense, he is pro-life, Cisneros is not. And that's a huge difference, especially as Roe v. Wade looks as if it's going to be overturned in just a few weeks from now. Especially as the state of Texas is a state that is going to advocate and has already passed laws restricting abortion access for women across the second most populous state in the nation. What you are finding is that this will be and has become a big issue within this district. And it now benefits Cisneros, especially considering where we are relative to the last primary. Now, we don't have a lot of data from the 28th district, but again, the differences could not be more apparent even in the endorsements, because that can tell you a lot about which factions of the Democratic Party actually back each individual candidate. For instance, Jessica Cisneros, who has she received the endorsement from? Bernie Sanders, a huge voice and huge face of the progressive movement. Elizabeth Warren as well. Ed Markey, I would say, is more well known in the New England area. I don't think this endorsement will really matter in Texas's 28th district, but I certainly think that Sanders and Warren know exactly what crowd they are appealing to and what crowd they are trying to excite and put the backing behind Cisneros. If you take a look at the U.S. representatives, what do you find? You have Ayanna Pressley. You have AOC. You have names, again, that are very, very much associated with the names that either have primaried from the left successfully or are progressive left politicians. In addition to that, who do you have? Wendy Davis. She should be a name that is a bit recognizable. Who do you have? You have Democracy for America, Emily's List, Justice Democrats, Our Revolution, Sunrise Movement. These are names and these are progressive organizations that are recognizable. When you go down to Henry Cuellar's endorsements, who do you have? You have Steny Hoyer, U.S. Representative from Maryland's 5th, my representative, the House Majority Leader, number 2 in the House. Jim Clyburn, U.S. Representative from South Carolina's 6th District, House Majority Whip, number 3 in the House. And Nancy Pelosi, U.S. Representative from California's 12th District and Speaker of the House of Representatives, number 1 in the House. These three make up that Democratic trifecta within the Congress. The Majority Leader, the Majority Whip, and then above all, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. If it couldn't be more apparent that there is a very clear backing from the establishment Democrats for Henry Cuellar versus the more, get out the traditional career politicians movement, the revolution type movement that you see from the left and leftist organizations within the Democratic Party. I mean, it's just so apparent the differences between the two. And when you take a look beyond that, we're not going to dive too much deeper into their policy, but it very clearly shows that there is a difference between these two candidates. And there is going to be a very interesting primary result. Because even leading up to this first primary, the polls told us that it was a very close race. It was a 1-point race. By the end of it, it ended up being a 2-point race. Nothing dramatically different. I am excited to see what this primary holds, but again, it will be a test for progressive candidates. Can they win in a district that is defined by its very, very large Hispanic population? 79% of all residents within this 28th district are Hispanic. 15.09% are white, meaning that when you look at that as a broader sense, you are talking about primarily within this district, white and Hispanic voters within the Texas 28th district. The reason why this would be a big win for progressive politicians is because when you think about and you actually just look at many of these regions where you have progressive politicians winning, for instance, the 3 senators here, Warren, Sanders, and Markey, come from some of the whitest states in the country, where that's where you traditionally see the progressive backing. Biden was not skyrocketed to victory by white voters, but rather, at least in the primary, by black voters, by Asian voters, by Hispanic voters. Biden won every demographic group besides white voters by the end of the primary, or at least did winning the white voters, but that's also because the primary was practically ended when COVID-19 hit. This will be a test about can progressive Democrats win in a district like this in a primary. And then, now we're going to jump to the general election. Back in 2020, this Texas district here went to Henry Cuellar by a margin of about 19 points across the district. Surprisingly enough, this district actually wasn't nearly as lopsided for Biden or practically any other Democrat. If you take a look at the partisan lean of the old district, it's Democrat plus 4. Henry Cuellar again won by 19. The Democrat plus 4 means that Biden was able to do at least better than where it was on the national level. The presidential result here, or that individual results that are used to calculate the PVI, find themselves to be about 4 points more than the national average. So in the largest sense, maybe a 9-point victory for a Democrat could result in this partisan lean. But what you find is that Henry Cuellar did significantly better. You're talking about a 19-point victory within this 28th district. And he did it because he was an incumbent. While he struggled to win that Democratic primary in a very real sense, he ended up winning the general by a very good amount. Republicans truly could have won this district, looking at how close it was. Republicans did win many competitive seats in the House races. They picked up 12 seats on an overall net and flipped 15 in total. This district very well could have been one of them, but it wasn't because Henry Cuellar was popular and was an incumbent, and that helped him a lot. Should there be an ousting by Jessica Cisneros in this primary runoff election, she will come into a district that is slightly more Democratic than where Henry Cuellar's district was back in 2020, but it won't be by any means a lockdown. In the 2020 election, what you saw was that there were many competitive races in districts that are brandished now as safe Republican. For instance, let's take a look at the state of Oklahoma. Why am I bringing up Oklahoma? Well, Democrats actually won in the previous 5th district back in 2018. It has a partisan lean of Republican plus 11. Democrats almost nearly won it again back in 2020. And it isn't just there. If you look across the nation, Democrats were in districts and in states where they otherwise should not have been competitive in. For instance, in New Mexico's 2nd district, let's go ahead and head over to the state of New Mexico. That district was a Republican lockdown. Looking at the old map here, it had a partisan lean of Republican plus 14. Now, it has a partisan lean of Democrat plus 4. Democrats are probably going to do a lot better now, but back then, keep in mind, Democrats were able to win here back in 2018 and only narrowly lost it in 2020, a Republican plus 14 district. So if Democrats were able to do that, even in 2020, in what was a much more neutral year for the Democratic Party, even beyond just the 2018 blue wave, imagine what a red wave would bring for a district that only has a partisan lean of Democrat plus 7. It absolutely is in play, but should Cisneros end up winning here by a margin that is surprising or a margin that is impressive to us, it tells us that individually, at least in this case, but potentially applicable on a much more nationwide level, that progressive politicians within majority minority districts like the 28th district can end up winning. The problem with this timing and the placement of this election is that should Cisneros end up winning and losing the general, I am confident this will be used as a campaign ploy by centrist and moderate Democrats against progressive politicians. And as much as there is a movement on the left to continue pushing for progressive politicians, it could do more damage should she win this race. I'm not at all trying to say that she shouldn't run or shouldn't have been running, because it is very clear she is running because she does defer pretty dramatically, ideologically wise, against Henry Cuellar. But I do think that because if she wins this and loses, it will negatively reflect on progressive politicians, even if it isn't directly their fault. But I do want to address the very real reality that Henry Cuellar was able to win by 19 points in a Democrat plus 4 district, which means that he did dramatically better than many other Democrats would have and did perform back in that district in 2020. So he definitely provides a level of electability for this election that Cisneros probably does not as a non-incumbent. Not necessarily because of her policies or anything. I think should she have been the incumbent for years now, like Cuellar had been, she very well could have won by 19 points. I think the problem lies in the fact that she's not an incumbent, but I think also there will be some pundits and there will be those who look into it and will say maybe there is a connection, and there very well could be. I don't know how this district votes, and I don't know exactly why they do what they do. But I do think that this also could be potentially a pushback on progressive reform and progressive policies within the Democratic Party. But should they win it, it will be a major, major victory. So high risk, high reward for progressive politicians in the state of Texas. It might push more progressives to run. It might stop some progressives from running, and it might play into a narrative that establishment Democrats have been pushing for quite some time now and have been quite successful with for a significant period of time. At the end of the day, Jessica Cisneros and Henry Cuellar are going to face off against each other this Tuesday. So the result will be very interesting, and we will find out who that Democratic nominee will be, and it will be a true test about whether or not these Democratic primary voters care about issues like abortion, care about progressive politicians versus centrist politicians, and where they align within a district that is typically not necessarily discussed too heavily. It will be very interesting to see, and we will be keeping a close eye on it. Unfortunately, I will not be live, but I would encourage you to keep a closer look on this runoff election because it will be very, very interesting. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 House election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.